He was 79 years old when he drove back to the town he had left without a word, without a letter, without a single phone call in more than 5 decades. The truck he drove was a rusted 1987 Ford with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when it wanted to. And he drove it 340 miles through the first cold week of November with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set so hard his back teeth ached. He had told himself he was just going to look, just to see what remained. He expected an empty lot, maybe, or a stranger's house remodeled beyond recognition, aluminum siding over the old clapboard, a new porch, someone else's wind chimes hanging where his mother's rose vine had climbed the rail each summer. What he did not expect, what he could not have prepared himself for in the 50 years he had spent not preparing, was the figure he saw standing in the front window when he pulled the truck to the shoulder of Route 9 and cut the engine and sat there in the sudden silence with his heart doing something irregular and frightening in his chest. Because the figure standing in that window was not a stranger, and it was not a ghost. Though for a long moment, Harold Eugene Casper was not entirely certain which of those would have been easier to bear. His mother had called the farmhouse on Birch Hollow Road the most beautiful mistake she ever made. She said it that way, a beautiful mistake, and she said it often, usually in the evenings when the light came through the kitchen window at that particular amber angle that turned everything it touched to something resembling gold. She meant that she had fallen in love with the house before she had fallen in love with the man who owned it, and that both loves had arrived too fast and left too little room for clear thinking, and that she had no regrets, not one, even though the house had drafty winters and a well that ran low every August, and a back pasture that flooded without warning. Harold's father, George Casper, had bought the property in 1951 for $6,200, a sum that had nearly emptied every account the man had, and he had done so in the full knowledge that the house needed a new roof and new wiring and a furnace that did not clank and shudder like something dying. He bought it anyway because his wife, then not yet his wife, had pressed her face against the car window as they drove past on a Sunday afternoon and said softly, almost to herself, "Oh, just that. Oh." And George Casper, who was not a romantic man in any way that showed, had made a decision in that moment that would shape the next 30 years of both their lives. Harold was born in the back bedroom of that house in the winter of 1945, 6 weeks early, and fighting from the very first breath, according to his mother. She told him that story every year on his birthday, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, telling him the same details in the same order: the snow, the roads that were impassable, the neighbor woman who had walked 3/4 of a mile through a blizzard to help, the way Harold had arrived already screaming, which his mother chose to interpret as a sign of character rather than distress. "You came into this world with opinions," she would say, and nothing about the following 34 years proved her wrong. Birch Hollow Road. In 1950 was the kind of place that existed in rural New England with a completeness that made the outside world feel theoretical. There were 9 families on the road: the Caspers, the Dumonts, the Pelletiers, the Marshes with their 6 children and their eternally optimistic garden, and 4 or 5 others whose names and faces Harold could still produce from memory with startling specificity even now, 7 decades later, in the cab of a truck parked on the shoulder with the engine ticking as it cooled. He could tell you that the Dumont children smelled of wood smoke and that Mrs. Pelletier kept a shrine to the Virgin Mary in a blue grotto in her front yard that the neighborhood children treated as a kind of landmark, a waypoint in their constant traveling between houses. He could tell you that the road itself was gravel until 1958, and that in mud season it was nearly impassable, and that every spring the ruts were deep enough to swallow a tire to the axle. He could tell you that in summer the whole road smelled of cut hay and whatever was blooming in Mrs. Marsh's garden, and in winter it smelled of nothing at all, just cold, clean, absolute nothing. His parents were not wealthy and did not pretend to be. George Casper ran a small machine shop in town that repaired farm equipment and did occasional work for the mill, and Eleanor Casper, Harold's mother, cleaned houses 3 days a week and grew a kitchen garden that was, by any reasonable standard, too large for 2 adults and 1 child. She canned everything: tomatoes, green beans, corn, pickled beets, apple butter in the fall, when the trees on the south side of the property dropped more fruit than they could eat in a year. The shelves in the root cellar ran floor to ceiling and were always full, always labeled in her small, cramped handwriting: always organized by date. Harold had spent his earliest years in that root cellar during thunderstorms, sitting on an upturned milk crate while his mother counted the seconds between lightning and thunder and told him, calmly and with great authority, exactly what was happening in the sky above them. He was not afraid of storms because she made science of them. She made science of everything that frightened. He was a middling student in school, not unintelligent, but restless, the kind of boy whose mind moved faster than the classroom could accommodate, so that he was always either bored or confused, rarely anything in between. His teachers found him difficult. He asked too many questions, and not always the assigned ones. He was not unkind, but he was direct in a way that some people experienced as combative. He had his mother's stubbornness and his father's silence. Not a natural combination, and one that would cause him significant trouble over the course of his life. He played baseball passably well. He built things with his hands. He read anything he could find, not the books assigned in school, but the ones he discovered himself. Paperbacks from the rotating rack at the pharmacy in town, his father's old volumes of history stacked in no particular order on the shelf in the parlor, his mother's library books that she borrowed and returned and replaced with unfailing regularity throughout his entire childhood. He read fast and widely and retained almost everything, which gave him the particular loneliness of someone who knows a great deal and has no one to tell. He met Margaret Dumont, youngest daughter of the Dumonts down the road, when they were both children, when meeting was simply a geographic function of being the same age in the same small place. They grew up alongside each other the way children on rural roads do, in and out of each other's houses, sharing the particular intimacy of boredom and proximity. By the time they were 16, something had shifted between them in the way things shift between 16-year-olds, suddenly and without adequate warning. And Harold found himself aware of Margaret in a way that was entirely new and somewhat inconvenient. She was a quiet girl with dark eyes and an unsettling quality of stillness. She thought before she spoke. She did not fill silence with noise. She could sit on the porch rail for an hour and watch the field and be genuinely occupied by it. And Harold, who could not sit still for 10 minutes, found this profoundly mysterious and profoundly attractive in ways he could not have articulated then and could barely articulate now, 7 decades later, with everything that had come after. What came after is the part of the story that Harold had spent 50 years not telling. He was 28 years old in the summer of 1973 when the argument happened. He referred to it that way, even in his own interior monologue, the argument, as though locating it in the definite article could contain it, give it edges, prevent it from sprawling across everything the way it had, in fact, sprawled. The argument was with his father, which is to say it was the argument, the one that had been building since Harold was 17 and developing opinions his father found inconvenient. George Casper was not a cruel man. This is important. He was not cruel. He was a man formed by a particular era and a particular geography and a particular set of beliefs about how a man conducted himself and what a son owed a father and what constituted an acceptable life for a person born into a family like theirs. He believed in work and silence and endurance. He believed that difficulty was character building by nature and that complaining about it was a sign of weakness. He believed, and here was the fault line, the deep geological fracture that ran under the whole of their relationship, that a son followed in a father's path, or if he did not follow in it exactly, he at least stayed near it, stayed visible within it, stayed in a life the father could recognize and approve. Harold, by the summer of 1973, had been working in the machine shop for 5 years. He was good at it, skilled with his hands, mechanically intuitive in a way that went beyond training, but he had also, in the preceding 3 years, been taking night classes at the community college 40 minutes away, studying engineering, not because anyone suggested it, but because it was what he wanted, what he had always wanted, and he had kept this information from his father with the precision of someone who knows they are managing something dangerous. He told his mother. His mother kept secrets the way the root cellar kept food, quietly, reliably, for as long as necessary. The night his father found out, Harold was not present for the discovery. He arrived home to find his father sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, which George Casper never did. Harold stood in the doorway and understood immediately, with the full-body clarity of someone whose body has known something for years that their mind has been avoiding, that the careful management was over. His father did not shout. He was not a shouting man. He spoke in a low, flat voice that was somehow worse than shouting. And what he said, the specific words, the specific sequence of them, Harold could still reproduce with perfect accuracy at 79 years old in a truck on the shoulder of Route 9, though he had never spoken them aloud to anyone, except once to the woman he eventually married in the dark in the first year of their marriage, when she had asked him directly, and he had decided, for the first and last time, to answer. His father had said, "I worked myself into the ground so you could have this. So you could have the shop, the house, this road, all of it. I gave you something. And what you've done is decided it wasn't enough. That I wasn't enough." Harold had said things in return. He had said them in the voice of a 28-year-old man who believed in his own clarity and had not yet learned that clarity at 28 is often just another word for inexperience. He said that he had his own life to live. He said that he had never asked to inherit the shop. He said, and this was the sentence that neither of them ever fully recovered from, he said that staying in Birch Hollow and running the machine shop until he died would be its own kind of death, and that his father had made his choices, and Harold intended to make his own. The silence that followed lasted approximately 40 seconds. Harold counted them, though he could not have said why he was counting. Then his father stood, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall to the bedroom and closed the door. Harold left 11 days later. He drove away in the early morning before anyone was up, with $312 in his wallet and a bag packed the night before with methodical thoroughness, as though packing carefully might stand in for the goodbye he could not figure out how to give. He drove north and then west and then kept driving. He had a contact, a college friend from his night classes, who had mentioned a firm in Columbus, Ohio that was hiring, and he drove toward that possibility with the forward momentum of someone who is not yet ready to look in the rearview mirror. He called his mother exactly once, 3 weeks after he left, from a payphone outside a gas station in western Pennsylvania. She answered on the second ring. There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds, and then she said, "Harold," as though she had been expecting it, as though she had known the shape of this moment long before it arrived. He told her he was fine. He told her he had a job. He told her he would write. He did not write. He told himself, and this is what he had been telling himself for 50 years in the low hours of the night when the story surfaced whether or not he invited it, that he would go back when things settled, when he was established, when he had something to show for the leaving, when his father had time to cool and he had time to find the right words. He kept this plan active in his mind for 6 years, adjusting the timeline as necessary, moving the departure date forward by increments small enough that each individual adjustment felt reasonable. He was 29, then 30, then 34. He married a woman named Ruth in 1977, a practical and generous woman who grew up in Cincinnati and had never been to New England, and who loved him with a patience that he recognized, even then, as something he had not earned and was not sure he deserved. He told Ruth about his family the way you tell someone about weather in a country you once visited, factually, briefly, without opening the door all the way. She listened. She did not push at first. Later she pushed. He did not open the door. His parents' letters stopped coming in 1978. He had not answered them. He told himself it was because he did not know what to say, and this was true as far as it went. What was also true, though he spent considerable energy not examining it, was that answering a letter requires you to make a decision, and Harold Casper, who was decisive about nearly everything in his professional life, decisive in the machine shop, decisive on construction sites, decisive in boardrooms when he eventually found himself in them, had never been able to make a decision about the road he had left in the dark at 4 a.m. in August 1973. Making a decision about that required him to name what he had done, and naming it was something he had protected himself from for so long that the protection had become structural. It was load-bearing. He was afraid of what would fall if he removed it. His father died in 1981. Harold found out from a letter his mother sent to an old address that was forwarded twice before it reached him, arriving 6 weeks after the funeral with a crease down the center where it had been folded for too long. He sat with it in the kitchen of the house in Columbus and read it twice. Ruth found him there an hour later. She said nothing. She sat down next to him and put her hand on the table next to his, not touching, just close, and that was exactly the right thing, and he had never forgotten it. He called his mother the next day, or he started to call her. He dialed the number he still remembered with perfect, painful clarity, and listened to it ring 4 times and then put the phone down before anyone answered. He told himself she would not want to hear from him. He told himself he would try again tomorrow. He did not try again. He did not know, not for certain, not for years, that his mother continued to live in the house on Birch Hollow Road. He did not know that she maintained the property largely alone after his father's death, with help from neighbors, some of whom were children of the families Harold had grown up alongside. He did not know that she kept his room exactly as he had left it for 11 years, before finally, at age 74, converting it to a sewing room because a person could maintain a shrine to absence for only so long before it became something other than hope. He did not know that she had spoken about him to the neighbors with an equanimity that was not entirely performance, that she had developed, over the long years of his silence, a philosophical acceptance of what had happened that was its own kind of extraordinary strength. He did not know these things. He had, in the specific and terrible way of someone who chooses not to know, arranged not to know them. Eleanor Casper died in November of 1997, in the house she had called a beautiful mistake, in the bedroom where Harold had been born. She was 84 years old. She did not die alone. A neighbor woman named Dorothy Pelletier, daughter of the same Pelletiers with the Virgin Mary Grotto in their front yard, had been checking in daily for the last 2 years of Eleanor's life, and she was there that morning, had been there through the night. Harold found out about his mother's death 6 days after it happened, through a phone call from a lawyer in town who had found his name in Eleanor's papers with a note that simply said, "Please make sure Harold knows." He had been 52 years old. He had been by that point a reasonably successful structural engineer. He and Ruth had a house in Columbus, 2 children, a son named Daniel, 22 years old by then, and a daughter named Claire, 19, and a life that looked, from the outside, like the life of someone who had figured things out. He sat in his home office and took the lawyer's call and listened and said very little, and then sat in the chair for a long time after hanging up. Ruth found him there later and knew from his face what the call had been. She had been waiting for this call for 20 years. She said, "Harold." He said, "She's gone." He did not go back for the funeral. This is the part of his story he found hardest to carry. He told himself, as he had been telling himself things for 25 years by then, that it was too late, that there was no point, that he couldn't face the people who had known his parents and known him as a boy and would look at him with the specific knowledge of what he had done, of the silence he had maintained. He told himself these things with the fluency of long practice. He did not examine them with much rigor. He had survived this long by not examining them. He did not go back. The house passed, through some mechanism of Eleanor's will that the lawyer explained in a subsequent letter that Harold read once and put in a drawer, to a distant cousin named Victor, someone Harold had met perhaps 3 times in childhood, a peripheral figure whose claim on the property was a matter of geography and longevity rather than love. Harold had no legal challenge and no energy for one, and, he told himself, no particular right. He had forfeited his claims a long time ago on a dark morning in August when he had driven away without looking in the rearview mirror. He did look, though, once. He had looked once, instinctively, when he hit the end of the road and turned onto the highway, and he had seen the house, just the dark shape of it against the slightly lighter dark of the pre-dawn sky. And then the curve of the road had taken it from him. He had looked. He just hadn't stopped. Ruth died in the spring of 2018 of pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks after diagnosis. She was 71 years old, and she was, as she had been for their entire 41-year marriage, practical and generous right up to the end, organizing her own affairs with a thoroughness that Harold found both deeply comforting and deeply heartbreaking. In the last weeks, when she was still lucid and the pain was manageable, she talked to him with a directness that was new between them, or not new exactly, but unguarded in a way that the dailiness of long marriage had papered over. She said things she had been thinking for decades. She said, "Daniel is lonely and you don't see it." She said, "Claire forgave you for the coldness years ago and you should know that." She said, "Harold, you have unfinished business that you've been carrying since before I met you, and I've watched it weigh on you for 41 years, and I want you to put it down before you run out of time." He did not ask her what she meant. He knew what she meant. His daughter Claire came to visit in the fall of 2022, driving up from where she lived in western Massachusetts, a 6-hour drive she made without complaint 4 or 5 times a year, which was exactly the kind of person she was. She was 47 years old by then, a social worker with a particular talent for finding the truth beneath the story people told about themselves, which Harold recognized was at least partly a skill she had developed growing up in his house. She arrived on a Thursday with a trunk full of groceries and spent the weekend repairing things: a loose porch step, a running toilet, a kitchen drawer that had jammed 2 months earlier, and that Harold had been managing around with the patience of a 78-year-old man who has run out of urgency about minor repairs. On the Sunday afternoon before she left, they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and she said, in the conversational but deliberate way she had when she was moving towards something, "Dad, I was looking at some old maps online." She was a person who looked at old maps online, which was one of the things about her that he found both specific and inexplicable. "And I found Birch Hollow Road. I found the house." He said nothing. She said, "It's still standing. I thought you'd want to know," he said, and he heard himself say it from somewhere slightly outside himself, that he appreciated her telling him. She looked at him for a moment with her mother's particular quality of patience. Then she said, "Dad, how much longer are you going to carry this?" He did not answer that evening. He did not answer it for 6 more months. But the question had been set down somewhere inside him, in a space he recognized as important, and once it was there, he found he could not make it comfortable to ignore. He found himself, in the blue hours of early morning, working through arguments he had made and remade for decades, and finding them less sturdy than they had once been. He found himself doing something he had mostly avoided for 50 years, actually thinking about the house, actually letting the details return. The kitchen light at that amber angle, the smell of the root cellar, the sound of the creek at the back of the property when it ran high in early spring. He found that the memories had not diminished with time. If anything, they had distilled, purified into something concentrated and very clear and somewhat devastating to encounter after so long of keeping the door shut. He made the decision on a Tuesday in October 2023. He did not tell Claire beforehand. He did not tell his son Daniel, who lived 90 miles away in a farmhouse with a leaking roof and called once a week on Sunday evenings with the regularity of a person who has learned from watching that showing up consistently is its own language of love. Harold packed a bag, filled the truck's tank, and drove east on a Wednesday morning with the particular resolve of a man who has waited too long for everything and has finally, at 79, run out of patience with his own delay. The drive took longer than it should have because he stopped twice, once for gas and once, unplanned, on the side of the highway in Vermont, where he sat for 22 minutes with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and went through everything he had been going through for 50 years. And then, as he had not done at 28 or 35 or 52 or 71, he went through it all the way to the end. He sat with the full weight of it. Every year, every letter he hadn't answered, every call he hadn't made, every decision not to decide. And he let himself feel the full dimension of it without the practiced numbness he had been relying on since roughly the summer of 1974. It was not comfortable. There is no word for what it was that is not an understatement. But he did it. He sat there for 22 minutes, and he went all the way through and came out the other side still breathing, which was the only outcome that allowed him to put the truck back in drive. Route 9 from the highway to Birch Hollow Road was 11 miles. He drove them at 35 miles an hour, slower than necessary, slower than the drivers behind him appreciated, but he was not ready to arrive any faster than this. The landscape changed around him in the way landscapes change in New England in November, the color mostly gone from the trees, the fields that residue color of dry hay, the sky a flat, pale gray that was not quite cloud and not quite sky, and had no particular intention of resolving into either. He recognized the road as he had not expected to recognize it, in the body rather than the mind. A deep somatic memory that knew this geography before his eyes had time to confirm it. The Pelletier place was still there, though it had been sided in vinyl and the grotto was gone from the front yard. The field that had belonged to the marshes was now a subdivision, perhaps 20 houses visible from the road, with the particular sameness of houses built all at once by the same contractor. The Dumont farm was, he didn't look directly at it. He would look at it another time if there was another time. He turned onto Birch Hollow Road. He drove the quarter-mile of packed gravel. Still gravel, which surprised him, which did something to his chest he didn't expect. And then the farmhouse came into view through the thinned trees, and he pulled to the shoulder and cut the engine. It was still standing. That was the first thing. The house was still standing, which was not guaranteed. He had braced for a ruin, a foundation, an absence, and the standing of it was so much more than he had permitted himself to hope for that he had to sit for a moment while his body adjusted to the fact of it. The roof was new or newer than the rest of the house. The porch was repaired, but the boards were different wood, paler, not yet weathered to match the original. The siding was in reasonable condition, better than he'd expected. Someone had been maintaining this property. Not perfectly, but consistently. Someone had cared for it. The rose vine was still on the porch rail, bare and skeletal in November, just the canes, but unmistakably there, the same plant or a descendant of it so close as to be continuous. He could not have explained why this mattered as much as it did. He sat in the truck and looked at the canes of the rose vine and felt something move through him that was approximately 50 years old and did not have a name. Then the figure appeared in the window. It was a woman, older than him, or appearing so, which at 79 was saying something. She was standing in the front window in a posture he recognized before he recognized anything else about her. A particular way of standing with her weight slightly to the left and one hand holding the curtain aside, exactly the way his mother had stood in that same window when she was watching for something. The recognition arrived in him like a current, full voltage, no delay, and it passed through every defense he had constructed over 50 years and landed somewhere central and unprotected. His hands left the steering wheel and came to rest in his lap, and he sat very still, because standing in the window of his mother's house, in his mother's posture, with his mother's quality of watching, was Dorothy Pelletier. Dorothy, who had been there when his mother died. Dorothy, who had checked on Eleanor every day for the last 2 years of her life. Dorothy, who would be, he calculated rapidly with the precision of old habit, 83 years old now if she was alive. If that was her, if this was real, and not some artifact of the drive and the cold and the weight of 50 years arriving all at once. She had not moved. She was watching the truck with the stillness of someone who has seen enough of life that very little makes them move quickly. He could not read her expression from this distance. He was not sure he was ready to read it from any distance. He sat in the truck for 7 minutes. He counted. Then he opened the door. She met him on the porch, had come outside without him seeing, the door opening quietly, so that by the time he reached the bottom step, she was standing at the top of them, wrapped in a cardigan, the color of old cream, her white hair pulled back with the same practicality she had always had. Her face was his mother's age, the age his mother had been when he last remembered her clearly, and the coincidence of this was so disorienting that he stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her and could not, for a moment, speak. She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was not angry. He had prepared for anger. He had prepared for the specific cold of a person who has decided over decades that you do not deserve warmth. He had prepared for the door closing in his face, for a voice through a screen saying, "I know who you are and I have nothing to say to you." He had prepared for every variation of that rejection. What he had not prepared for was Dorothy Pelletier saying, in a voice that was tired and direct and not unkind, "I wondered if you'd come." He said, "Dorothy." She said, "Harold Eugene Casper, standing on my porch 50 years later like he's been meaning to stop by." He said, "Because it was the only honest thing he had. I should have come sooner." She looked at him for another moment, the way she had always looked at things, assessing, not unkind, but not soft, seeing clearly and deciding what to do with what she saw. Then she said, "Come inside before you freeze to death. We've got 50 years to get through and I'm not getting any younger." The inside of the house was, he did not have a word ready for what the inside of the house was. He stood in the front hall and looked into the kitchen, and it was changed and unchanged in equal measure, which was somehow the hardest combination to absorb. The bones of the house were identical, the layout, the proportions, the angle of the kitchen window. But the furnishings were Dorothy's, a different table, different chairs, different curtains, though the curtains were a similar color, as though even that choice had been made in conversation with memory. The root cellar door was still in the kitchen floor. He noticed it immediately and looked at it for perhaps a second longer than anything else in the room. Dorothy noticed. She said, "She showed me how to can tomatoes the summer before she died. Said someone should know how to do it, and I was the most likely candidate." He sat down at the kitchen table. The chair was different, but the table was the same position, same angle to the window, and the light coming through the window in November was a paler version of that amber light his mother had loved. And something in his chest that had been clenched for a very long time began, with considerable reluctance and considerable pain, to loosen. Dorothy made coffee. She made it the way people make coffee when they have been making it in the same kitchen for many years, without looking, without measuring, with the efficiency of a body that knows exactly what it's doing. She set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him and put her own hands around her own cup and said, "Where do you want to start?" He said, "I want to start with her. I want to know what I missed." And Dorothy Pelletier, who had been his mother's closest companion in the final 2 decades of Eleanor Casper's life, who had held his mother's hand on the morning she died, who had maintained this house for 26 years since the distant cousin Victor had inherited it, and discovered within 3 years that inheriting a property and caring for a property were not the same thing, who had negotiated a kind of informal stewardship that the lawyers had eventually formalized into a legal tenancy. Dorothy looked at him across the table and took a breath and began. She told him about his mother's 70s, which were better than he would have imagined. She told him about Eleanor's garden, which had grown increasingly ambitious as she aged, as though the limitations of the body had been redirected into the unlimited possibility of what could be coaxed from soil. She told him that Eleanor had taught herself watercolor painting at age 71 and had filled 14 sketchbooks with paintings of the property, the house from the field, the creek, the rose vine in every season, the root cellar door, the particular light through the kitchen window that she had apparently painted 23 times and never found fully satisfying. She told him that Eleanor had been, to the extent that a person raising herself can be said to be something, happy, not without sadness, not without the specific grief of Harold's absence, which Dorothy named directly and without softening, but whole, functional, herself. He said, "Did she talk about me?" Dorothy said, "Yes." He waited. Dorothy said, "She said you were the best thing she ever made and the biggest disappointment of her life. And she said it the same way every time, without bitterness, like it was just the truth, and the truth was 2 things at once." He said nothing for a moment. The coffee was hot, and he held it with both hands the way his mother had always held things, the specific cradle of palms around a warm cup. And he sat with what Dorothy had said and let it be true without trying to manage it. He said, "She kept the rose vine." Dorothy said, "She talked to it in the mornings." I don't know what she said, I never asked. He stayed for 3 days. He had not planned to stay more than a few hours, had not, if he was honest, been certain he would stay more than a few minutes. But Dorothy had a spare room and a practicality about feeding people that brooked little argument, and by the second evening, he was helping her carry wood from the shed to the porch, and they were talking the way people talk when they are past the necessity of impressing each other. He went down into the root cellar on the second morning, alone, with a flashlight, and stood in it for a long time. The shelves were still there, still labeled, though in Dorothy's handwriting now, not his mother's. He stood in that small underground room where he had sat on a milk crate during thunderstorms, while his mother counted lightning and explained the sky, and he felt the full weight of 50 years in a way that sitting in a truck or at a kitchen table had not quite allowed. He stood there until he had felt all of it. Then he went back upstairs. Dorothy showed him the sketchbooks on the afternoon of the second day. All 14 of them, stacked in a cedar chest in what had been the sewing room, and before that, Harold's childhood bedroom. She handed them to him and left him alone with them, which was either tactfulness or efficiency, or both. And he sat on the bed in the room that had been his and looked at his mother's paintings for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was not, as a painter, technically accomplished, but she was faithful. Every painting was an act of exact attention to the thing being painted. The rose vine looked like the rose vine, the creek looked like the creek, the kitchen window in its amber light looked like exactly itself. 23 paintings of the same window, and in every one he could see her trying to capture something that kept moving when she approached it. He understood the impulse. He had been trying to capture something for 50 years. He was not sure he had come any closer. He called Claire from his cell phone on the second night, sitting on the porch in the cold. She answered on the second ring. He told her where he was. There was a silence of about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Dad," just that, Dead. He said, "I should have come sooner." She said, "Yes." Then she said, "But you came." He called Daniel the next morning. Daniel's silence when Harold told him was longer, 11 seconds, which Harold counted. And then Daniel said in a voice that was working to stay level, "How is it?" Harold said, "It's the house. It's still the house." Daniel said, "I want to see it sometime if that's okay." Harold said, "I'll talk to Dorothy." On the morning of the third day before he left, Dorothy walked him around the property. It was cold, the first real cold of the season, the ground hard and the sky the color of old pewter, and they walked slowly, which suited both of them, and she showed him what had changed and what hadn't. The back pasture still flooded. She said it every spring, same as always, just fills up overnight. Your father would have something to say about it. The well was new, replaced in 2004. The barn had been repaired twice. The apple trees on the south side were still producing, though fewer of them. The creek at the back ran where it had always run. They stood at the creek for a while. He had forgotten how cold it looked in November, the water low and clear over dark stones, the banks bare. He had grown up with the sound of that creek as ambient noise, so constant and so ordinary that he had never consciously listened to it until he was somewhere it was absent. Standing at its edge at 79, he found he had been listening to it his whole life without knowing. Dorothy said without particular emphasis, "She forgave you. I want you to know that. Not because it was easy and not because you deserved it necessarily, but because she said forgiveness was something she did for herself and not for the person who needed forgiving. She said she learned that from the Bible and from experience, and that both sources agreed." He said, "I'm not sure I've forgiven myself." She said, "No, but maybe that's next." He drove back to Columbus on a Thursday afternoon. The truck's heater worked for the first 100 miles and then stopped, and he drove the last 240 miles in the cold with his coat on and the collar up, and thought about Dorothy in her house, his mother's house, his parents' house, the house he had been born in, and about the rose vine on the porch rail bare in November and waiting for spring. He thought about the 23 paintings of the kitchen window. He thought about a woman talking to a rose vine in the mornings and what she might have said. He thought about 50 years and what they contained and what they had cost and what, improbably, still remained. He called Claire when he got home, 11:30 at night. Too late to call, she answered immediately. He said, "I'm home." She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about this honestly for a moment, which was not his usual approach to the question, but seemed, at 79, overdue. He said, "Like I've been carrying something a long time and I've set it down, but my arms still remember the weight." She said, "That sounds about right." He said, "I'm going back in the spring. I want to see the rose vine when it's blooming." She said, "I'll come with you." He said, "I'd like that." He sat in the kitchen after hanging up. The house was quiet and dark except for the light over the stove, which he left on out of habit, a small domestic beacon against the dark that Ruth had started years ago, and that he had continued without ever deciding to continue it. He sat in the chair he always sat in at this table and looked at his hands. The hands of a 79-year-old man who had built things and neglected things and driven 340 miles to stand at a creek in November and let 50 years catch up with him at last. His hands were not steady. They hadn't been for a few years, but they were his, and they had done what he needed them to do. And he thought about his mother, painting 23 versions of the same window and understanding finally that some things you return to, not because you expect to get them exactly right, but because the returning is itself the point, because the act of going back is the thing, because there is no other way to know what has survived your absence, and what, improbably, has been waiting. If you have carried something like this, a silence you kept too long, a road you drove away from and told yourself you'd return to and then didn't, a person you should have called, I want you to hear something from Harold's story that I think is true. It is not that it is ever too late, because sometimes it is. Sometimes the person you needed to face is gone, and the house is rubble, and the road has been widened into a highway. Sometimes you do run out of time, and that is a real and serious thing that deserves to be named. But sometimes, the house is still standing. The rose vine survived. Someone kept the lights on, and the root cellar stocked and maintained the property through all the years you were somewhere else arranging reasons not to return. And if that is your situation, if there is still time, if the door has not yet closed, then the question Dorothy asked is the right one. How much longer are you going to carry this? Not because carrying is weakness. Harold Casper carried it for 50 years, and he was not a weak man. But because your arms remember the weight even after you've set it down, and setting it down even late, even imperfectly, even at 79 on a cold Thursday in November, is still setting it down. It is still that, and it is enough to begin with. It has to be.